On the dangers of this report, by the way, if you are legitimately interested in countering the far right, one of the things you should probably be interested in is an accurate and reasonable analysis and portrayal of the far right. Because what you see here is you see the widening of the definition of the term to refer to groups that historically would not have been considered far right at all.
You're watching Gript Media, and today I have our deputy editor Gary Kavanagh in the studio with me to talk about a pretty interesting report that was printed in the Irish Times and the Independent. What was it, Gary?
So it was a list of the rankings of Irish organisations that an American organisation with a totally unpronounceable acronym for a name had decided were hate and extremism groups.
I see, and it is the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism.
Yes, or every time I see its name I think of the word GAPE, but GPAHE,
GPAHE,
something like that.
Something like that.
Unintelligible, much like their report.
And was it a report?
So I would say no. What it was, and it was reported as being a report, but a report to me is an actual piece of scholarly work. It's research, it has evidence, it backs things up. What this was a single page of their website, which had, I think, between 300 and 400 words of an introduction, which basically claimed the Irish far right are growing and are a threat, but none of it was backed up, none of it was sourced. And then it had organisational bios of the 12 organisations that they say are far right hate and extremism organisations. And what I'd have to say about that is oftentimes when we say far right, there's a sense it's not really defined. Right. Basically we go with something that, the researcher doesn't like. Mm-hmm. But these guys do define it. And they define it in a way which makes clear that groups they say are far right are either actively involved in violence or are promoting violence, particularly terrorist attacks and mass killings.
Okay, and given some of the names that we read in the report, it's quite ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, we won't go too much into the names because I'm pretty sure people are going to get sued about this in kind of record time, because I've never seen an article that so much went, please sue us. Yeah. So there are groups there that are maybe in unpopular positions, particularly in relation to religious affairs. And it is kind of a gamut of groups from, fairly mainstream religious groups to groups that are legitimately a bit more out there. But it's also notable that a couple of the groups are incredibly small. Like one of the groups they mention, they say that experts estimate that there's less than 10 members. So that is the bar to be included in this list.
I see. And having read it myself, I couldn't help but think it sounded like a second-year college essay that everyone who doesn't agree with me is Hitler.
It seems incredibly cherry-picked, and it seems incredibly kind of speculative. And it's a tactic we've seen before from people in this space, where they will put together this long array of coincidences or just random occurrences, but present them in a way which says, and where they can go, and therefore this person is far right. But if you look at any individual step, it's nonsense. It'll be things like someone, a far right magazine once wrote about this person, even though this person was not involved with that magazine. But because they were covered, therefore through a long process, they must themselves be far right.
And you said it was from an American body. Who was behind that?
So the group is formed of people who came from the Southern Poverty Law Centre, which is a group which does similar work in America, but is much larger, much more advanced. It looks like some of the organisers from the SPLC left the SPLC and formed this group as a standalone. Now what's interesting is the two women who are involved in this from the SPLC, one is Wendy Via and one is Heidi Becknick, I think. I probably butchered her last name. Both of them left the SPLC around the same time frame. And we don't know exactly why they left the SPLC, but it's interesting to note Wendy Via, who was their chief communications officer, left, I think, the month after the SPLC had to pay out somewhere in the region of $3.5 million to a British anti-extremism expert who had been classed as an anti-Muslim bigot, despite the fact he was a Muslim himself. And they had to pay him, I think it was $3.4 million, basically by way of getting rid of that defamation. And she left shortly afterwards. So those two things may be connected, we don't know. Okay. And then the second woman, the SPLC had somewhat of a reckoning in about 2019, 2020, where it turned out that despite the fact that the SPLC was one of the most famous progressive organisations dealing with racial issues, that there had been a history which had effectively been covered up of sexual harassment, sexual assault. Apparently there were issues with racial equity in the workplace. And the founders of one of the founders of the SPLC was pushed out and the other founder left shortly thereafter. And there was basically a clearing out of middle management. Now, this woman Heidi says that she'd been thinking of a change for a while, but she does leave at nearly exactly the time where other senior leaders are being pushed out of the organisation, and there's basically a clearing of house. And they both left very, very good salaries, I must say.
And given the kind of unprofessional nature of the report, how do you think it ended up in two of the biggest publications in Ireland?
Well, on the unprofessional nature of it, that's pretty much an SPCL trademark at this point. The SPLC came to prominence fighting against the Ku Klux Klan in America. They would sue members of the Ku Klux Klan for violence that had been committed by other members of the group, and they were actually very effective at combating the Klan. But as the Klan kind of fell, they found that they didn't have the targets they had traditionally had, and they started putting together lists of hate organisations. Now, that over time grew into the Year in Hate and Extremism, which is their annual report which looks at hate groups. And the methodology of that is incredibly dodgy.
So it's kind of like an attempt to self-legitimise.
What has been said about it by critics of the Southern Poverty Law Centre, and by critics both on the right and the left, is that the SPLC deliberately bigs up organisations or sometimes just individuals so that they can then fundraise off them. The SPLC has had, it's one of the best fundraisers of any charity I've ever seen. They have roughly $500 million in their bank accounts at the minute, a surprising amount of it in offshore accounts. And they fundraise rigorously based on the results of those lists. So there is a financial incentive for them to come out and say, hate is getting worse, there are these groups and we need money to fight them. And that is a substantial part of the SPLC's work. And that's kind of what we see with this. There's a similar kind of thing there. We're going to pick these groups. As I said, one group has less than 10 members by their own estimate, and we will push them out there as part of a growing trend of the far right in Ireland. And then one presumes there's also a fundraising element to this amongst themselves. And as to how it got into Irish newspapers, a press release was sent out, but I'm not sure who it was sent to because we didn't receive it anyway, and being an American organisation, I wouldn't imagine they have an Irish media mailing list. It's possible they reach out directly to particular reporters, but they also thank an Irish organisation at the bottom of their webpage, and it's possible that that organisation reached out to the newspapers or particular journalists with the story as well.
And what happened with the story since the criticism of it?
So it initially comes out in the Independent and the Irish Times. The Independent, within about a day, takes it down because I would imagine someone in the legal department noticed it and had somewhat of a mild heart attack. The Irish Times, I think, is still up. And then it was mentioned in things like the Beacon, kind of smaller, more kind of far left media. And then I reported on it for Gript and basically went through the issues with it, that there's no evidence here and it's making an incredibly serious charge, but with nothing to back it up. And newspapers were perfectly happy to carry that without attempting to do due diligence. Now, I also know that several of the people named in the report, that newspapers did not reach out to them for comment or to offer them any chance to protect their good name. In the case of both the Independent and the Times, they didn't name the groups, which is probably why they didn't feel the need to do that. But I mean, my reaction when I saw the Irish Times piece was, oh, that's interesting. I have the name of the organisation. I want to see who's on the report. I just Googled it with the information they gave, found it immediately. So, I mean, I'm not sure that's going to be a great defence for them later. So we published that. John McGurk then published another piece looking at the use of the term far right to delegitimise opinions and its usage by the left and these organisations. And then there were articles, I think Mick Clifford in the Examiner did the same thing and pointed out that this is an incredibly serious charge based on nothing, but also seems to be absolutely incorrect in relation to some of the organisations on the list. They're simply not far right or violent in any way. And people familiar with those organisations, even people not fond of those organisations, would know that. So I mean, it should have been immediately obvious to the Irish Times and the Irish Independent that there were problems with this list.
One of the bodies on the list is actually a gay rights organisation, is that correct?
Yeah, so there is a gay rights organisation on it. And the issue that the report takes with it is that they say it's an anti-transgender organisation. And I mean, it's a debate that's been going on both in wider society and amongst the kind of gay community for a while. The involvement of transgender, or the T with the LGB, basically. And it's a debate that's become increasingly poisonous. And we're starting to see groups that are in this sort of space that are more focused on gay rights rather than transgender rights being referred to as far right. Now, I've met several members of that group in person, and they were to a man, but to a woman, they were all impeccably left-wing. You're talking like, you know, old school socialist feminists of the second wave mostly. But I think why you're starting to see it is, in many cases, I think the use of far right is purely a delegitimization tactic.
Again, it's like everyone that doesn't agree with me is Hitler.
Kind of, but it's what you get is there's a lot of well-meaning people who, if you were to say someone is going to use a slur like that to get someone out of the debate, they would think, you know, that's not how people are. They have an infinite source of goodwill, particularly from people who seem very respectable. So it's a very effective way to knock someone out of the conversation, because every time someone says something, you say, well, that's a far-right group, and then you don't need to deal with its criticisms. I mean, lots of groups, you get it, particularly now online and on the social media, particularly Twitter. Like, someone will say something, and you say, that's a far-right group, and then everything they say is therefore tainted, and there's never really any explanation of why they're far-right. And part of this is, I think, activists and journalists and academics tend to have a very particular political view. They tend to be more to the left, and they don't really understand a lot of the right's views, but they also have a tendency to assume if anyone disagrees with them on social issues that they are far right. So, you know, people in the gay rights space who are mostly concerned again with gay rather than transgender rights, they're far right because they disagree with us on transgender rights, even though they would be very economically left-wing, probably quite socially liberal. That's all you need. You disagree with them, you're far right. In the same way, you saw during the abortion referendum, there was a sort of argument that this is all coming from the right wing. But most of the people I knew who were involved in the abortion referendum, particularly in the groups and were, you know, kind of managerial capacities, were kind of old school leftists. Some of them were socially conservative, some of them were religious, for some of them abortion was the only issue, but it didn't matter. All they were was far right because they had a particular view on that particular issue. And you're seeing just an amazing amount of that. And from activists and journalists, it's kind of expected, it's fine. But you're seeing more and more academics who also talk like that, despite the fact that they should have the relevant education to know that that's not how any of this works. Someone does not go from, you know, socialist to fascist because they have a pro-life position or because they disagree with you on one thing. But it seems increasingly that's the way it's done.
So it's being used to kind of like delegitimize and in some cases maybe even dehumanize people.
I think so. And I think in some cases it's because people believe they're right. But I think in specific cases there is a very deliberate bad faith action there, which is designed deliberately to wound and remove someone from a fight or a debate or something of that nature. And they don't believe it. They just think it's useful. And this sort of stuff does have consequences, though. We were talking about the Southern Poverty Law Centre's list. In 2012, one of the groups on the list, I think it was called the Family Research Centre, a gunman walked into their lobby and started taking pot shots at their employees. He shot one of the employees of that organisation and then was tackled to the ground and disarmed. And when he was questioned about why he had done it, he said, well, the SPLC listed them as an anti-gay hate organisation, something which they denied, by the way. They said they were just a socially conservative think tank. But you know, that is a consequence of this. If you keep saying that these people are promoting violence, eventually someone is, you know, they might do something.
So you're inspiring the very kind of actions that you say you're trying to prevent.
Well, that has been a long argument against these sort of lists and against the way that the SPLC has handled things, that because they need these groups to exist, And because they need them to drive funding, they bring attention to them. So you can have a group that has, no one is aware of its existence, and suddenly you have an incredibly major institution talking about them and what they're doing. And the argument has long been that you might actually attract people to that
The
organisation.
Barbra Streisand effect.
Yeah, by telling them about them. And because they don't just report on them, they tend to report on them on the most kind of sensationalist way possible. So they will big up the achievements of this group to make it look as threatening as possible, which again might be attractive to people who are looking for a group like that and hear about this and assume, that's a group that's going places.
And do they dox people?
It's hard to kind of answer that because the SPLC relies on massive amounts of information. And yes, if you were doing something anonymously and they could link it to you, yes, they would publish it. They'd have no issue with that. But I'm not sure if that would fit the profile of doxing, given that they are, this is a research body. This is what they do.
But just to bring it back to Ireland, I noticed that in the report, they did give kind of locations where people are by county. And Ireland is a small place. It wouldn't be hard to find someone if you say they live in County Wexford.
Yeah, it's a much smaller place. I think part of the problem we have here is that the report was made by Americans, none of whom appear to have any involvement here. Now, it appears they had help from an Irish group, but they themselves aren't familiar with Ireland. And you can see it in some of the language they use, where they're saying, they're putting these groups in and saying that they promote violence and mass killings and things like that. Whereas no Irish person familiar with these groups would point at them and be like, yeah, mass killings, absolutely, right. That's what they want. So I think they're coming from the American perspective, where again, under the First Amendment, you can give your opinion on something. An opinion is nearly totally protected from defamation. So you just put things out there in the most inflammatory way possible, and you use that then to drive your own fundraising. And actually the list that the SPLC puts out, that was curated for many years by one of the founders of this new group. So it's not like they don't have form in this. And so I keep talking about funding and fundraising, and I just want to push for people that in America, this is massive business. As I said, the SPLC has, I think, at this point, roughly $500 million in its bank accounts. But when you look at because the SPLC is a charity, you can look at how much its top executives are earning. And both the people involved in this new group were amongst the top executives before they left under whatever circumstances. And I mean, one of these women was earning, I think, $240,000 a year plus another $40,000 in expenses. One was in, I think, I made 150 somewhere around there, 177, I think, actually, before she left, and 30,000 in expenses. So there is big money in this area. There is a massive financial incentive to push out these sort of things in the most provocative fashion available. And people have been asking why they focused on Ireland, particularly because I believe this is the first international report they've put out. And it might be because they had the Irish group and therefore it was easy to do. But from a fundraising perspective, there's a massive body of Irish Americans who might be particularly interested in this kind of thing and from whom you could fundraise for. And that's what we see with these groups. We see massive levels of fundraising based on claims about hate that might seem ludicrous to someone who lives in the country. On the dangers of this report, by the way, if you are legitimately interested in countering the far right, one of the things you should probably be interested in is an accurate and reasonable analysis and portrayal of the far right. Because what you see here is you see the widening of the definition of the term to refer to groups that historically would not have been considered far right at all, would have been considered maybe conservative, maybe relatively mainstream, and haven't really changed since then. And as the definition broadens and becomes kind of more amorphous, you run the risk that when you come out and say, well, this group is far right, you will eventually hit a point where the public no longer associates the far right with what it should be, the extremes, but rather you say it and they're like, well, do you mean far right or do you mean like far right? And you basically, you'll cut your own knees off eventually because people will just stop reacting to it in such a way. And you've seen that with fascists. The tendency of the left to call people fascists has largely removed the power of the word. It's so common now that it doesn't really mean anything. You'd kind of be surprised if someone who was called fascist by the left actually turned out to be a fascist. mostly because there's very few of them, but also because they call everyone it now. And if you're really concerned about the far right, you should not want to replicate that with the term far right, because eventually it will spread to where things that the general public believes will be classed as far right. And on the transgender issue particularly, you run that risk. And if you keep saying, well, the people who say this are the far right, but the public agrees with it, well, are you going to convince a section of the public that actually the far right sounds like they have all the good ideas? Which is probably not what you want to do.
You probably don't want to recruit.
No, but you run that risk by just bigging it up and removing the exclusiveness around the word. But it's a very effective fundraising tool, so all of the incentives are to misuse it. But if you look at the actual impact and you wanted to have the best impact, you'd be very careful about how you do. But that's not what we're seeing in these groups, it's not what we're seeing in academia, and it's not what we're seeing in the media. I mean, there seems to be an endless array of accusations that the far right is growing or the far right is this, it's that. But when you actually look on the ground or you look at the election results in Ireland, there is no signs that the far right is growing because it's about 24 lads and a dog.